Imagine a landscape carved by ancient forces, a labyrinth of sandstone and shadow stretching for hundreds of miles under the unforgiving Utah sun. This is the vast expanse of the San Rafael Swell, a place of breathtaking beauty and chilling isolation. It's a place where the earth seems to swallow secrets whole, where the wind whispers tales of those who ventured in and never returned. It was into this magnificent, perilous wilderness that a married couple, a pair of adventurers named David and Catherine, embarked on what they believed would be a serene escape. They sought solace in its quiet grandeur, a temporary reprieve from the cacophony of modern life. They envisioned days filled with hiking, exploration, and the simple joy of each other's company, surrounded by the raw, untamed majesty of nature. But the mountains hold no favorites, and the desert, in its indifference, offers no mercy. On a seemingly ordinary day, they simply vanished. The year was 1988, and the world they left behind would spend the next 15 years grappling with their inexplicable disappearance. What could possibly have transpired in such a desolate, remote corner of the American West? Was it a tragic accident, a sudden turn of fate in a land known for its hidden dangers? Or was something far more sinister at play, a dark act concealed by the sheer enormity of the wilderness itself? The questions hung heavy in the air, a persistent, gnawing echo in the minds of their loved ones. For years, the San Rafael Swell held its silence, guarding its secrets with an impenetrable stoicism. The search efforts, initially fervent and expansive, eventually dwindled, leaving behind only the lingering pain of the unknown. The families, caught in a purgatory of grief and speculation, could only hope for a definitive answer, a closure that seemed forever out of reach. They pictured David and Catherine, vibrant and full of life, swallowed by the endless canyons, their laughter silenced by the relentless wind. The hope that clung to the edges of despair began to fray, thinning with each passing year until it was barely a thread. Yet, as time stretched on, as seasons cycled through the desert, bringing scorching summers and frigid winters, the earth, in its own slow, deliberate way, began to turn. The rocks shifted, the sands moved, and the elements continued their tireless work, carving, eroding, and eventually revealing. It would take a decade and a half for the canyon to finally relinquish its terrible truth, a truth that would shatter every assumption, every theory, and expose a tragedy far darker than anyone could have imagined. The initial disappearance, shrouded in the vastness of the wilderness, would eventually be stripped bare, exposing not merely an accident, but a premeditated horror, a crime buried deep beneath the desert floor. The saga of David and Catherine was not merely a tale of vanishing, it was a testament to the brutal, unyielding patience of the land and the eventual, devastating revelation it would bring. This is the story of two lives lost, a mystery that spanned generations, and the chilling discovery that finally unearthed the truth. The alarm bells began to ring softly at first, a faint, insistent chime in the background of ordinary life. David and Catherine were meticulously organized, creatures of habit, who always communicated their movements, especially when venturing into remote territory. When their planned return date came and went without a word, a low hum of unease began to vibrate through their closest circle. A day turned into 2, then 3, and the hum escalated into a frantic thrum. Calls to their home went unanswered. Their vehicle was nowhere to be seen. The initial assumption, a common one in these parts, was a minor mishap. A flat tire, a wrong turn, perhaps a temporary loss of communication in the vast expanse of the swell. But as more time elapsed, the benign explanations began to crumble under the weight of growing dread. Their families, intimately familiar with David and Catherine's cautious nature, knew instinctively that something was profoundly wrong. They weren't reckless. They were experienced outdoors enthusiasts who respected the wilderness and understood its potential dangers. The thought of them simply getting lost seemed improbable, almost insulting to their capabilities. This wasn't a casual stroll in a park. This was a well-planned expedition by seasoned adventurers. Local authorities were alerted, and a preliminary search commenced. Deputies, their faces etched with the grim resolve of those who regularly confront the desert's unforgiving reality, began to retrace the couple's anticipated route. They drove the dusty, corrugated roads leading into the heart of the San Rafael swell, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign, any anomaly. The initial search was a race against time, a desperate hope that David and Catherine might be injured, stranded, but still alive. The search efforts quickly escalated, drawing in volunteers, experienced trackers, and search and rescue teams. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky, their rotors beating a mournful rhythm against the silence of the canyons. Ground crews, equipped with maps and an unyielding determination, scoured trails, examined remote campsites, and descended into narrow slot canyons, their voices echoing in the desolate air. Every abandoned campfire, every discarded piece of litter, every broken branch became a potential clue, meticulously examined for any connection to the missing couple. Family members, their faces drawn with anxiety, arrived to join the search, their presence a stark reminder of the human cost of the mystery. They walked shoulder to shoulder with strangers, united by a singular, aching purpose: to find David and Catherine. The search expanded, stretching for weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of unforgiving terrain. The hope, once a vibrant flame, began to flicker, threatened by the sheer scale of the wilderness and the relentless march of time. Days bled into nights, and nights into another dawn, each sunrise bringing renewed effort, but no definitive answers. The vastness of the San Rafael swell, initially a source of allure, now seemed to mock their efforts, concealing its secrets with an almost malicious intent. The relentless sun, the biting winds, the sheer physical exhaustion, all contributed to a growing sense of despair. Could two people simply vanish without a trace in such a way? No note, no struggle, no abandoned gear. It seemed incomprehensible. The official search eventually wound down, the resources strained, the leads exhausted. The investigators, seasoned professionals, who had seen their share of tragic ends in the wilderness, were left with nothing but theories, none of which fully explained the complete absence of any tangible evidence. Had they been victims of a flash flood, swept away and buried under tons of silt? Had they fallen from a sheer cliff face, their bodies hidden in some inaccessible crevice? Or was there something more sinister at play, a human element in this vast natural stage? The silence of the canyons offered no confession, only an echoing void where answers should have been. The family, however, refused to abandon hope. They continued their own private searches, poring over maps, revisiting known locations, and clinging to any whisper of a clue. But with each passing year, the trail grew colder, the memories more distant, and the hope of a joyous reunion faded into the bitter reality of an unsolved mystery. The San Rafael swell held David and Catherine in its stony embrace, and for 15 long years it refused to let them go. The silence was deafening, a perpetual monument to their unresolved fate. 15 years, a lifetime for some, an eternity for others. For the families of David and Catherine, it was a purgatory of unresolved grief, a relentless ache that defied healing. The initial shock had long since faded, replaced by a dull, persistent sorrow, punctuated by occasional flashes of rekindled hope whenever a new lead, however tenuous, emerged. But each lead, like a mirage in the desert, always evaporated into thin air. The couple had been officially presumed dead, a bureaucratic necessity that offered no emotional closure. Their names, once spoken with joy, were now whispered with a melancholic reverence, forever linked to the mystery of the San Rafael swell. The wilderness had claimed them, or so it seemed, swallowing their story whole, leaving only a void. Then, in the spring of 2003, a seemingly innocuous discovery shattered the carefully constructed peace of resignation. 2 hikers, traversing a remote, seldom visited section of the swell, stumbled upon something out of place, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a faded, weathered backpack, half buried beneath a scrub oak, its canvas ripped and stained. A flicker of curiosity, then a jolt of alarm. They cautiously approached, their instincts screaming that this was no ordinary lost item. They nudged it with a stick, and what they saw sent a chill down their spines. Among the decaying contents of the backpack was a small, tarnished silver pendant, intricately engraved with the initials DC. A ripple of recognition, then a sickening realization. This was not just a backpack. This was a relic from a ghost story that had haunted Utah for a decade and a half. The hikers, unnerved but understanding the gravity of their find, immediately contacted the authorities. The news, traveling like wildfire through the small communities surrounding the swell, brought with it a torrent of emotions. For the families, it was a seismic event, ripping open old wounds while simultaneously offering a sliver of hope, a tangible link to their lost loved ones. Could this finally be the answer they had so desperately sought? The site was quickly secured, transformed into an active crime scene. Investigators, many of whom were new to the force since the original disappearance, arrived with a fresh perspective and the benefit of advanced forensic techniques unavailable in 1988. The barren canyon floor, once meticulously scoured, now held the promise of hidden truths. Every pebble, every grain of sand, every sparse plant was examined with painstaking detail. The backpack itself was a treasure trove of information, even in its deteriorated state. Its contents, though waterlogged and sun-bleached, provided a poignant glimpse into the couple's last known moments. There were fragments of a map, a partially eaten energy bar, and a rusted compass, all mundane items, yet imbued with immense significance. But it was the pendant, David's pendant, that truly solidified the connection. His sister, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and renewed determination, confirmed its authenticity. It was an item he rarely took off, a sentimental piece of jewelry. Its presence here, in such a remote location, screamed that something more than a simple accident had occurred. The discovery of the backpack and the pendant ignited a dormant investigation, breathing new life into a cold case that had long been relegated to the annals of unsolved mysteries. The focus shifted dramatically. This wasn't just a search and rescue operation anymore. It was a forensic examination of a potential crime scene. The question was no longer where they were, but what happened to them. The meticulous search of the surrounding area intensified, guided by the location of the backpack. The terrain was challenging, a jagged tapestry of rock and crevice, but the investigators were relentless. They combed every inch, their eyes trained for any further sign, any disturbance in the ancient landscape. The air crackled with a renewed sense of purpose, a grim determination to uncover the full, brutal truth. The San Rafael swell, which had held its secrets for so long, was finally beginning to yield its terrible bounty. The stage was set for a discovery that would not only confirm the worst fears of David and Catherine's families, but also expose a calculated act of violence, hidden for 15 agonizing years. The air in the canyon grew heavy with anticipation. The discovery of David's pendant and the backpack had not only reignited the investigation, but had also sharpened its focus. The search grid, meticulously laid out, now radiated from the backpack's location, expanding outward into the desolate, unforgiving landscape. Investigators, driven by a renewed sense of urgency, combed through every crevice, every rock formation, every patch of desert flora. The silence of the swell, once merely vast, now seemed to throb with an unspoken story, a chilling narrative waiting to be unearthed. The breakthrough came not from a sweeping aerial search, but from the patient, methodical work of ground crews. Weeks after the initial discovery, a sharp-eyed forensic anthropologist, his gaze trained to detect the subtlest anomalies in the earth, noticed a disturbance. It was almost imperceptible, a slight depression in the compacted soil, a faint discoloration, a scattering of small, unusual rocks. It was a burial site, expertly concealed by nature's indifferent hand and the passage of time. The archaeologist, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and professional excitement, knelt down, carefully brushing away layers of dust and loose stone. What he uncovered sent a collective shudder through the entire investigative team. There, beneath a thin veneer of earth, lay two sets of skeletal remains, intertwined in a final macabre embrace. David and Catherine. 15 years after they vanished, the desert had finally relinquished its terrible secret. The scene was one of profound horror and immense sorrow. The bones, bleached white by the sun and eroded by the elements, were undeniable. But it was not just the presence of the remains that was shocking. It was the chilling details that began to emerge during the painstaking excavation. The bodies were not merely victims of a natural disaster, tragically lost and buried. This was a crime scene, meticulously arranged and hidden with malicious intent. Forensic anthropologists and criminologists worked with an almost reverent precision, each movement calculated to preserve every shred of evidence. They carefully extracted the bones, documenting their positions, the subtle fractures, the signs of trauma that spoke volumes about the violence that had ended 2 lives. The initial examination revealed critical clues, a bullet casing lodged near one of the skulls, and distinctive, deep-seated wounds on both sets of remains consistent with blunt force trauma. This was no accident. This was murder. The revelation sent shockwaves far beyond the San Rafael swell, reaching the families who had endured a decade and a half of agonizing uncertainty. The confirmation of their loved ones' deaths, while devastating, also brought a perverse sense of relief. The endless cycle of hope and despair was finally broken. But this relief was quickly overshadowed by a new, more horrifying realization. David and Catherine had not just been lost to the wilderness. They had been brutally murdered. The focus of the investigation shifted dramatically, transforming from a missing persons case to a homicide inquiry. The questions now intensified, taking on a darker hue. Who could have done this? Why? And how had the killer managed to conceal such a horrific act for so long in such a vast, empty expanse? The desert, which had been so adept at hiding the truth, now offered a silent, skeletal testimony to the barbarity it had witnessed. The remains of David and Catherine, once vibrant and full of life, now lay as stark evidence of a heinous crime, challenging the investigators to unravel a mystery that had matured with age, becoming more complex, more deeply entrenched in the unforgiving earth. The discovery in the canyon was not an end, but a terrifying new beginning, signaling the start of a relentless pursuit for justice in a case that had long been considered cold, swallowed by the sands of time. The unearthing of David and Catherine's remains marked a pivotal turning point, shifting the narrative from a haunting mystery to a full-blown murder investigation. The scene at the burial site, though 15 years old, held a wealth of forensic clues, each piece painstakingly collected and analyzed. The bullet casing, a small but damning piece of evidence, was identified as a .22 caliber. The blunt force trauma, evident on both skulls, suggested a violent struggle, an attempt to subdue or silence the victims. But the desert, for all its unforgiving nature, had also preserved certain aspects of the crime. The way the bodies were positioned, the nature of the wounds, even the types of soil disturbances, all contributed to a growing profile of the killer and the circumstances of the murder. The immediate area around the burial site was scoured once more, this time with a focused intensity, searching for anything that might have been overlooked in the initial missing persons search. And then another crucial piece of the puzzle emerged. Not far from the graves, half hidden beneath a cluster of sagebrush, was a crude, handmade antenna constructed from common household materials and wires. It seemed out of place, almost anachronistic in the ancient wilderness. Investigators initially struggled to understand its significance. What connection could a homemade antenna have to the murder of David and Catherine? Its presence was puzzling, a bizarre anomaly in an otherwise brutal crime scene. But as the forensic team processed it, they made a critical discovery. The antenna was designed to boost the signal of a CB radio. In 1988, CB radios were popular among truckers, outdoor enthusiasts, and those who frequented remote areas where traditional phone service was non-existent. It wasn't a standard piece of David and Catherine's hiking gear. Its presence suggested a third party, someone who needed to communicate from the deep canyons of the swell, someone who likely intended to stay hidden. The plot thickened, leading investigators down a new and unexpected path. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It implied a degree of planning, a deliberate attempt to evade detection. Who would need to boost a CB radio signal in such a remote area, and why? The antenna became a key piece of evidence, pointing toward a perpetrator who was not merely passing through, but was perhaps residing in the area, using the isolation to their advantage. The team began to look for individuals known to frequent the more remote parts of the San Rafael swell, individuals who might have lived off the grid or had a history of suspicious behavior. They combed through old police reports, interviewed long-time residents, and revisited forgotten corners of the community. The investigation became a deep dive into the fringes of society, searching for someone who might have considered the vast, empty canyons their domain, a place where they could operate unseen and unchallenged. This new direction brought with it an unsettling realization. The killer wasn't a phantom, but a tangible presence, someone who understood the nuances of the wilderness, someone who had likely adapted to its harsh realities. The discovery of the antenna suggested a cold, calculating mind, a killer who had not only committed a brutal act, but had also taken steps to ensure their own concealment and communication. The silence of the desert had, for 15 years, protected a killer. But now, with the meticulous work of forensics and the relentless pursuit of justice, that silence was slowly, agonizingly breaking. The antenna, a seemingly insignificant object, had become a beacon, pointing directly towards a dark truth buried for too long. The investigators knew they were close, that the threads of the past were finally converging, leading them to the individual who had committed this horrific crime and left a family in agonizing limbo for a decade and a half. The story of David and Catherine was no longer just a tale of vanishing. It was becoming a narrative of calculated murder and the slow, inexorable march toward justice. The homemade antenna, once an inexplicable artifact, now hummed with silent implications, radiating its own grim story across the desolate canyons. Its existence pointed towards a specific type of individual, someone who not only knew the San Rafael swell intimately, but also maintained a deliberate detachment from conventional society. This was not a passing tourist, nor a lost hiker. This was a resident of the fringes, someone who used the wilderness as both a sanctuary and a shield. Investigators, armed with this crucial new insight, shifted their focus from general searches to targeted inquiries within the tight-knit, often reclusive communities surrounding the swell. They began to revisit old acquaintances, re-examine forgotten names, and piece together snippets of information about those who preferred the solitude of the wilderness. It wasn't long before a name surfaced repeatedly: Robert. Robert was a known figure in the area, a solitary man who lived an almost completely off-grid existence, relying on his wits and the land for survival. He was known for his unconventional lifestyle, his distrust of authority, and his preference for isolation. More crucially, Robert was also known for his proficiency with electronics and his habit of building makeshift communication devices, including custom CB radio antennas. A chilling picture began to form. Robert had been living in the swell for years, establishing a kind of dominion over certain remote areas. Could he have encountered David and Catherine during their expedition? The possibility was terrifyingly plausible. The investigative team, now with a clear suspect in mind, moved with renewed purpose. They secured a warrant for Robert's property, a ramshackle cabin tucked away in an almost inaccessible canyon, a place where few dared to venture. The approach was cautious, calculated. Robert was known to be wary, even hostile towards outsiders. What they found at his property was a scene that solidified their suspicions, weaving the threads of the past into a tapestry of horrifying certainty. Inside the cabin, among a chaotic jumble of tools, survival gear, and salvaged electronics, detectives found a small, rusted hatchet. Its blade, though cleaned, still bore faint traces of what forensic tests later confirmed to be human blood, blood that matched David and Catherine's DNA. This was the blunt force trauma weapon, hidden for years within the killer's lair. Even more damning was the discovery of a .22 caliber rifle, a weapon of the same caliber as the bullet casing found at the burial site. Ballistics tests, conducted with swift urgency, confirmed it was the murder weapon. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered across 15 years of silence and speculation, now fit together with a horrifying precision. Robert, the reclusive wilderness dweller, was their killer. When confronted with the evidence, Robert remained largely silent, his eyes revealing a disturbing lack of remorse. His motive, slowly pieced together through meticulous investigation, painted a grim picture of a disturbed individual driven by a potent mix of paranoia, territoriality, and possibly an opportunistic rage. It appeared that David and Catherine had simply stumbled into his secluded domain, a place he considered his own, and paid the ultimate price for their unintentional trespass. He had seen them as intruders, a threat to his carefully constructed isolation, and reacted with brutal, premeditated violence. The legal proceedings that followed were somber, but definitive. Robert was charged with the murders of David and Catherine. The evidence, though 15 years old, was overwhelming. The recovered remains, the forensic analysis of the weapons, the presence of the handmade antenna, and the chilling narrative of a man who saw the wilderness not as a shared natural wonder, but as his private, inviolable kingdom. The story of David and Catherine, once a haunting, unsolved mystery, finally reached its agonizing conclusion. Justice, though delayed for a decade and a half, was ultimately served. The San Rafael swell, which had held their secret for so long, had at last revealed the truth, exposing the darkness that can lurk even in the most breathtakingly beautiful and seemingly serene landscapes. The families, scarred by years of uncertainty, found a measure of closure, a grim solace in knowing what happened and who was responsible. The silence of the canyons, once a symbol of endless enigma, now whispered a tale of tragedy, perseverance, and the ultimate triumph of forensic science and human dedication.